The silent watcher. It was 3:17 a.m. when Jason woke up. His heart pounded in his chest as though someone had just slammed him awake from a deep sleep. The room was dark, too dark, and the silence pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating in its stillness. There were no sounds of wind outside, no creaks from the house settling. Just the faintest hum of the alarm clock beside his bed. Jason blinked, his mind slow to shake off the remnants of sleep. The fog in his head cleared slowly, but the feeling of dread that had woken him lingered. He lay still for a moment, listening to the strange quiet that filled the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The same old furniture stood in their usual spots, the bed, the nightstand, the chair by the mirror. But tonight, something was different. His gaze slowly drifted toward the far corner of the room. There, where the chair stood next to the mirror, the space seemed darker than usual, almost as though the shadows had grown thicker, more tangible. Jason stared, trying to shake the eerie sensation building in his chest, but his mind couldn't let go of the feeling that something was wrong. He squinted, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than an empty chair, like it always had been. But then his breath caught in his throat, and his heart skipped a beat. There was something sitting in the chair. Jason's eyes widened as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was humanoid in shape, but unlike any person he had ever seen. It sat so still, so unnaturally rigid, that it didn't seem like it belonged in the room at all. The darkness around it felt heavier, thicker, as if it was feeding off the shadow itself. Jason's throat tightened. He had to be imagining it, right? His mind was still foggy from sleep, his body not fully awake. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became. The figure was real. It wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of his exhausted mind. It was sitting in the chair, facing him. Jason held his breath, unable to look away. The figure was unnaturally still. Too still. It sat with its back straight, its posture like something carved out of stone, rigid and unyielding. He couldn't make out any features at first, just a dark silhouette against the dim glow from the alarm clock. Then, he saw it. Two faintly glowing eyes stared back at him, piercing the darkness like dying embers. They were the only things about the figure that seemed alive, burning with an unsettling light in the otherwise pitch-black room. Jason's stomach lurched. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't even waver. They just watched him. Unblinking. Unfeeling. A shiver ran through his body. His skin prickled with cold, and a lump formed in his throat. He couldn't breathe. His entire body went rigid, as though he were rooted to the bed, unable to move or even blink. All he could do was stare into those glowing eyes, his heart thundering in his chest. The longer he looked, the more real the figure became. It wasn't a trick of the light, nor was it a figment of his imagination. It was a creature, something ancient and malevolent, sitting in his room, watching him. Jason tried to speak, but his throat was too tight. The words stuck in his chest, paralyzed by the fear that had taken over his body. He tried to move his hands, to reach for the light, but they refused to obey. His limbs were heavy, like lead. He was trapped in his own body, imprisoned by the terror that had consumed him. The figure remained silent, unmoving, as if it was content to simply observe. Time stretched on in that suffocating silence, each second dragging like an eternity. Jason's mind raced. Was this real? Was he dreaming? He couldn't tell anymore. Everything felt distant, as if he were floating outside his own body, unable to break free from the horror that held him captive. Then, just as Jason thought he might go mad from the weight of the creature's gaze, it moved. The figure shifted slightly, its head tilting to one side, almost like a curious predator sizing up its prey. Jason's breath hitched, and his chest tightened. His stomach twisted into knots, and he felt his pulse spike. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. The figure's eyes never left his. Jason's legs shook beneath him, but his body remained frozen. He couldn't look away. Something about those eyes, they were pulling him in, drawing him closer, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn away, to get up, to run. But he couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Then, it did something that made Jason's blood run cold. The figure raised one of its long, spindly fingers to its lips. The motion was slow, too slow, like it was savoring the moment. The finger moved in a grotesque parody of a shushing gesture, a warning, a command. Shoo! The sound was faint, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. Jason felt it vibrate in his chest, deep and unnatural, like it was coming from the creature itself. The word echoed in his mind, seeping into his thoughts, filling him with a sense of impending doom. The creature moved again, this time more abruptly. It stood. Jason's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened as the figure unfolded itself from the chair, stretching and shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its limbs were impossibly long, too long for any human to possess. They bent at unnatural angles, as if the bones were made of something more flexible than flesh. The creature's body jerked and twisted like a marionette, its movements rigid and wrong. It stood taller now, towering over the chair, its head brushing the ceiling. The room seemed to shrink in the face of its presence. Jason could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, louder than ever, as the creature stepped toward him, one slow, deliberate movement at a time. It made no sound as it moved. Its feet made no noise against the wooden floor, yet Jason could feel the weight of its steps reverberating through the air, through his very bones. The hum in the room grew louder, like a low, guttural growl vibrating in his skull. Closer. It was coming closer. Jason's paralysis began to break. His body trembled with fear, his muscles finally finding the strength to move. He pushed himself upright, his hand fumbling for the nightstand, reaching for the lamp. He had to turn the light on. He had to see the creature, to make sure it wasn't real. His fingers brushed the lamp, knocking it over, sending it crashing to the floor with a loud thunk. The room was plunged into darkness. Panic surged in Jason's chest. He couldn't see. The creature was still out there, somewhere, moving closer. He could feel it. The air had become thick and suffocating, and every breath felt like a struggle. The hum grew louder, turning into something more insidious. A low growl that reverberated in the pit of his stomach, like the creature was feeding off his fear. Jason could feel the presence of it, just inches away from him, and he knew it was watching, waiting. Then he felt it, a breath, cold and rancid, against the back of his neck. Jason's skin crawled. His heart pounded so loud he thought it might burst. He couldn't look back. He couldn't bring himself to turn around, to face whatever it was. But then, in that low, gravelly voice that sounded like it came from the deepest depths of the earth. The creature whispered again, "Don't look behind you." Jason froze. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, but his body refused. His muscles locked in place, his entire being paralyzed by the creature's words. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as the darkness pressed in on him from all sides. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The room fell silent. Jason held his breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. But the silence only grew deeper, more oppressive, as though the very air had thickened, drawing the terror closer. Jason could feel the presence behind him, could sense it hovering just out of reach. And then, without warning, the whisper came again. "Don't look behind you." This time, Jason didn't wait. He had no choice. He had to. He turned. And there, standing in the doorway, was the creature.